Welcome to the concluding part 2 of my conversation with Ben Sawyer, ex-bomb disposal officer and change manager at Oxford University Press. For those who haven't heard it, I beseech you to go listen to part 1 of this conversation, where we explore Ben's experience as a military leader in Northern Ireland, first cutting his teeth, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in some of the most tense situations you can possibly imagine. In this part of the conversation, which you're about to hear, Ben tells us how he's taken those experiences as a leader in the military and now is applying them as a change manager in his role at Oxford University Press. Some brilliant insights around innovation, around agility, about leading people. He gets very humble and talks about some of the places where he failed as a leader. Very powerful stuff. Without further ado, I give you part 2. And this brings us to your life now, with as you say, with children and working for the Oxford University Press.
Yes,
the biggest university press in the world.
Certainly, yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think OUP has people in about 52 countries or so. So yeah, very widely spread. The big areas are so they've got academic publishing, which does a lot of journals and a lot of printing of books of academic interest. Then we've got the education division, who are looking at supporting schools within the school curriculum. So everything. So a lot of kids in the UK will have learned to read through English, Oxford Reading Tree, through Biff and Chip, and a lot of maths like Newbicon stuff. Again, that's all AUP. And then we've also got people doing the same sort of things in South Africa, Kenya, Australia, China, Pakistan, India. So all catering to local schools markets. And then we have the English language teaching. And again, Oxford University Press is one of the biggest ELT for English language teaching or English training providers, publishers. And they've also teamed up now with the university for the Oxford Test of English. And so again, they sell ELTs all the way, so massive in Spain, in Italy, Poland, China. So again, all around the world.
Yeah.
And that was again down over in Central and South America as well.
And of course, the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yes.
Probably the most iconic.
Absolutely, yes.
Publication.
Yes.
Yeah. Which my cameraman and I were trying to read in the foyer here in reception.
Yeah.
Impressive tome.
Yes,
the whole thing printed.
Although I think it's rarely used now as a printed tome. It's most of the Oxford English Dictionary use now it's all online because it's so vast, and it's used a lot now as well for data. So I think on Google, if you type in for words, you can get the Oxford definition of the word, and so there's a lot of interaction with technology of how they use the data sets.
Yeah.
And also in the humanities, because it's the OED, it's a history of the English language, so it takes a lot of the words in there aren't really in common use anymore, but also it's how words evolve and when was it first used, how is its use changed across history. So it's really interesting if you can get it on the website, where you can actually look at certain words and see examples of use over the hundreds of years.
Yeah. And you gave me a tour.
Yes.
Around the building.
Yes. Yeah, through seeing some of the entry cards.
Yeah. And one of the oldest companies in the world.
Yes. So, I mean, it's been publishing, I think, for over 400 years.
Well, certainly
in
up there.
In some way or the other. Yes.
Yeah. And you're a change agent.
I'm a change manager.
Change manager. Yeah.
So I get involved a lot in, but also I guess I do some managing individual changes, but most of what I do is about how do we manage and lead change across the press. I guess, but it's everything from developing courses on the psychology of change for our management and leadership courses, through to kind of coaching and mentoring people, to kind of designing ways of working for change managers and advising on how do you run change impact sessions and things like that.
Right.
So it's more about looking at how we change rather than individual changes.
And what have you taken from your time in the army and applied as a change manager?
I think one of the biggest things is incremental. It's the need for incremental change. I think there's what we were quite good at, especially within the bomb disposal teams, was changing very quickly and not incrementally. So we didn't have the power to, and we didn't have the resources to say, this wheelbarrow is rubbish, we want a new one, and go and buy us a new one, because that's going for the procurement chain, and that can take years and years and years. It's more about okay, so this is the wheelbarrow, this is the robot we've got. What can we do with it? How can we make it better? And it's then it's the little tweaks on it, and it's everything to, and it's how can we, so when we get onto a target, so in Northern Ireland, there was the Irish Republican terrorists, they were more about destroying property and causing, they did a lot of murdering individuals. They didn't tend to use car bombs for mass casualties. Sometimes they did, some of the times by mistake or sometimes deliberately, they did kill lots of people with car bombs, but there was a tendency to try and disrupt, so blowing up high streets. So think like the Manchester bombing, where they put a car bomb out and then they'll phone through a warning so the police can evacuate.
Okay.
So the bomb disposal teams, they had a robot that could get up there and disrupt the device explosively. So it still creates a lot of damage, but not nearly as much damage as a big car bomb. But it's then a race. It's you've got the warning that there's a device there. So how quickly can you get there and disrupt it? Whereas the terrorists, they know where you're based and they know how long it takes to drive there, and they want to give enough time to evacuate people, but they don't want to give you time to actually get there and disrupt it. So it's how many can you shave half a second here off, half a second there. So we would practice our things like our arrival drills. So when we arrive at the target, how quickly can we get the robot off the vehicle, loaded up, down the road and shooting the target. And we practice that time and time again, and we practice it in different weather conditions as well. So we do our procedures work in the rain? What happens if the number 2 jumps off and slips and twists his ankle? Who's going to replace him? Who's going to do all his parts in the process? So we cross train, and we train again and again and again. It's what can you do to shave a second off here, a second off there, or what can you do to make it more certain that you're not going to slip or you're not going to fumble something, and it's always seeking those marginal gains of, because by the time you've got a second here, a second there, a bit of certainty there, actually that all adds up. It's all cumulative. And I think we were very good at making those marginal gains, and also constantly seeking to, after every mission, coming back and actually talking about, well, what could we have done better there? So there really was a culture of, we've always got to be better, we've always got to do it better, and constantly reviewing what we did and learning from it.
Okay. And I get, yeah.
And whereas I think within business organisations, it can be a lot more difficult to do that, because it's that time factor. It's you've got that, you don't often have the time to train or to review things. It's you've done something operationally, part of your job, and then you're on to the next thing. You don't have the capacity to review and does it make things better. And also often there's that other areas seen where there's not that feeling of, we don't own this process, so we follow it, but we can't make it better because we're not empowered to do that. It's not for us to do that. So there's the feeling of, we don't have the capacity to do it, we don't have permission to do it, and maybe we don't have the knowledge or tools to do it. Whereas I think within the bomb disposal teams, it's very much, we owned the way our team work. We had the capacity to do it most of the time, because if you're not out on a device, you're training and preparing for a device. There was some day-to-day stuff that you need to get in there, but there was always time for training and making things better. And we had, I guess we didn't.
Well, that's a key phrase. There was always time for training and making things better.
Yes.
And how many kind of corporate teams could say that?
Yeah, and but some of it was we made time for it.
Yeah.
But some of it is actually our job was to train and make it better. And then the tools.
Yeah, and then there's another important
Yes.
point. Our job was to train and make it better.
Yes.
How many people would say
Yeah.
that was true of their role?
I think there was also that element of capacity. So it's, I mean, if you have someone working in an operational team and their job is taken up, 100% of their job is business as usual, when's their time to actually improve their job or improve themselves? And you see this with, or even to actually enact change. So I think the Boston Consulting Group, the BCG now, they have an equation where they look at how likely projects and change projects are to succeed. And one of the bits in the equation is effort. And it's basically how much effort do people taking part in the change need to do on top of their business as usual role. And if it's more than about 10%, then it starts actually really adversely affecting the likelihood of success. And you see that some of the organisations more adept at change, it's because change is part of their job. So if they've got a BAU role doing whatever, a business as usual role doing something, that may be 70, 80% of their time. And then 20% of their time is actually given over to, it's that free time where they've got, well, it's not free to take up, but it's continuous improvement or taking part in change projects or self-improvement, or it's time where they've got that capacity to do other things rather than actually improving something or taking part in change has to be something that you do after your job finishes at 5, you're in until 6 doing it, or that's your lunch hour is doing it, or something like that.
Or when the next change project comes along, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's got so bad that
yes,
we need to do something drastic.
And then the other one is that feeling of it's that permission. It's within our team. We owned our procedures. We have a vested interest in doing it. So absolutely, we wouldn't go and seek permission to go and do something and change the way we work. We're just going to do it.
Yeah, and even your story about the wheelbarrow is that you also had that spirit of, well, we will make some change here. We're not going to wait for procurement. And that reminds me of the guests we've had who've talked a lot about lean and Kaizen within lean. And one of the principles there is we change what we have without any change in the technology, without any money. We're just simply going to make a change with what we've got at hand as being a key principle.
So, I mean, a nice example. So on the wheelbarrow carries disruptors. So these are, a disruptor is kind of a metal tube with a small explosive charge at the back, and it fires water. And the idea is it tears apart the time power unit of the IED. It tears it apart and it doesn't function. So we'd have a couple of those mounted on the wheelbarrow. And it's really hard, if you've got a camera that sits above the two weapons, but it's really difficult to judge distance. And obviously you don't want to nudge the device or the car or whatever you're shooting at, but you don't want to do too far if you wanted to stand off about 2 inches. Now the American route is they started putting laser rangefinders on there, which that sucks in rain and stuff like that. It's expensive. We would have on the end of each weapon a bit of gaffer tape that stuck out with another bit of gaffer tape sticking up, and when the gaffer tape flexed a bit, you knew that the end of the weapon was 2 inches from what you wanted to shoot at. It's cheap, it works in the rain, and it was perfect. So I mean, that's not something that we developed in our team. That's just something that someone developed in Northern Ireland, a way of doing it, and it's stuck, and it's one of these things that a team will have thought that up, and then they would have told the other teams, and then it spread, and it became part of our SOPs, and it became taught in our schools. And there were lots of things like how in Northern Ireland, the way you adapt the wheelbarrow to shoot at bombs underneath the cars. So under vehicle IEDs they were one of the common devices in Northern Ireland. So it's how do you configure the wheelbarrow to shoot it? And bearing in mind the wheelbarrow is quite big. So there was a way of, basically there's a knowledge way that someone had worked out on one of the teams. Again, they'd spread the knowledge, and then it become to be what we taught at the schools about how a way to rig up using broom handles, gaffer tape and extended cables, and that you could then basically gaffer tape onto the front end of the wheelbarrow so you could shoot the device. And it was just it was that kind of attitude of you're always looking to what can we do, how can we do this better, what can we improvise that would work better than this.
Yeah. What can we do within our constraints? That's such a powerful question, isn't it? And married to an environment or a culture where you've got the time to ask yourself that question and do something about it.
Yeah,
right?
You've got the capacity to do it, and also the willingness to get out and test it no matter what the weather is, and to keep on experimenting when it doesn't work. Kind of, well, why didn't it work? Yeah. What was good about it? What wasn't so good about it?
So do you see as part of your role then is finding ways to create that environment in teams?
So sometimes, yes. So there are some teams here that I've been working with on how can they start using some elements of lean, things like visual management, and how can they do stand-ups a bit better, and how can they start kind of using visual management to capture their problems.
Visual management, what's that?
So it's this idea that rather than it's trying to make your reports and returns, what you're doing within your team, trying to make it visual in the way it's presented, so it makes it easier to see patterns and see if there's something going wrong. So it could be anything from a graph to the way you track your plan on the board. So it's basically trying to make information available visually.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the types of activities you get involved with the teams you work with here.
Yes, and it's quite varied. So it's all very different for different teams.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I did lack in the army was the tools to do what we were doing better. So I think we were quite naive in our ways of approaching. So there's lots of stuff a lot of tools you can use from Lean for measuring process flows and actually looking for where you've got blockages and bringing theory constraints with bottlenecks and things. And there's some of it we kind of grasped instinctively, but I can't help but think that actually we could have done a better job if we'd had a better awareness of these tools.
Right.
And these other techniques that are out there in industry that we weren't really aware of. So we were really chasing the idea of we need to continue to do what we're doing, actually seconds count, but we weren't aware of kind of the more theoretical concepts of lean and marginal gains and things like that. So it's
right. It seems to me that that's in some senses much more important than a particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the mindset and the capacity are the most critical things. I just think we could have made maybe better gains if we'd had other tools to apply to it. Yeah, but the important thing is the mindset.
But that's a very important point, isn't it? Because I do find a lot of my work with organisations is you can teach some of the lean theory, you can expose people to these tools and ways of thinking about improving, but they haven't got the time. What you said, the capacity to do the training and the continuous improvement. And it's all for now.
Yeah.
For now, right?
And also it's that mindset that this is an optional thing. This is something you need to do. It needs to be part of your. You can't just have a process that everyone follows and then that's it. That's the process you're going to follow for the next 20 years.
Yeah, but I suppose that's the other thing, the interesting aspect to the situations you were in the army is that there was such a compelling need to improve. We may save lives here. And it's how do you recreate that in the corporate context?
It's also, the terrorists and the insurgents were very good at iterative development as well. So, for example, take Afghanistan. So they started initially the first victim-operated IEDs that we saw there were pressure plates. So it's mostly two old rusty saw blades held apart by a couple of blocks of wood. So they're held parallel apart by a couple of blocks of wood, a wire to each, wrap the whole thing in rubber and bury it under the ground so that when someone treads on it, the two bits of the saw blade meet and the current can flow and the device functions. So we start using metal detectors. So the person, the leader of the patrol, has a metal detector sweep over the area and that detects the saw blades. They can then either go around it or call in a bomb disposal team to deal with it. So then the Taliban say, well, okay, they're detecting all these metal ones. What can we do to use that they won't detect. So they start using devices that use less metal than we can detect. So, or using graphite from batteries, or all sorts of things. They're finding conductors that wouldn't be detected by metal detectors. So they started using those. So we then started using ground penetration radar, which again would find those again. So then they said, well, they're finding those devices. They started using, rather than pressure plates, they started using command wires. So they'd have someone watching on the end of a wire with a battery. So we then started, and it's that constant iterations of they do something, we counter it, they do something to counter it, and that happens time and time again through every campaign, and it happens through, I mean, major warfare as well. You see what happens with the development of tanks in the Second World War, how that the armour versus the size of the weapon develops. Again, it's that continuous improvement to react to what the other side are doing.
Right. I suppose. Yeah, that's a. It's not just that you're saving lives; it's that your enemy's constantly iterating around you. So.
Yeah, and the idea. So what was his name? Denning, I think his name was. So he was an American fighter pilot in Korea, I think it was, and he looked at why often American fighter pilots were beating enemy Chinese fighter pilots, despite the American being inferior aircraft at times. And he concluded it was decision making, and he developed this thing called the OODA loop. OODA. So, and it's this idea that you observe what your opponent is doing, you orientate it according to what you're doing, you decide what you want to do, and then you take action. And the idea is that your opponent will also be following that loop. And then there's a term in the military: can you get inside your opposition's OODA loop? So if you can make your OODA loop smaller than their OODA loop, it means that by the time they're trying to decide what to do, you've already taken action. So their observations and orientation is out of date. So they're then deciding what to do on out of date information. And so OODA loop now, I've seen this talk as well. Now it's I think some businesses have taken it up. So it's that idea of how can you get it inside the OODA loop of your competition, working at government level as well. So it's designed for fighter pilots, but it works across military situations and across all sorts of situations. It's basically can you gather information, analyze it, decide a course of action, and take the action faster than whoever you're trying to compete against can.
Okay.
So it was constantly that is, can we get inside the OODA loop for Al Qaeda or the Taliban or whoever the opposition was.
Yeah, that's a very powerful idea. And what just springs to mind is the stats on Amazon and how quickly they're updating their website multiple times a second.
Absolutely.
So you've got to fight pretty hard to get inside there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm guessing the world of university press isn't quite as fast as that, but still, it's an important
It's getting
idea.
there. I mean, especially education technology, because it's so. And people like Google and Amazon are getting into the field of education. So there really is an awareness that we do need to move faster. We do need to be able to bring products to market much faster, because if we don't, then these big tech companies and increasingly small kind of tech startups, there are people out there with great ideas. I think where we differ is that we've got the content, and I think things like that for English language teaching and for maths and things like that, the content is some of the best in the world. Whereas someone like Google may have better platforms. It's how then who meets up with them, and there are various partnerships that OUP are in with technology companies, and there's a lot of work with OUP developing its own stuff as well.
Yeah.
So there's a big drive towards digital. That's the way forward.
Yeah. It's fascinating to see who wins these wars over coming years.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be. I think, especially for education, it's not necessarily us or them. There's a lot of there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of working together.
I guess there's more willingness to do that in the realm of education. Yeah, I can see that. I thought we'd touch on this chapter you've written in a book. So you're also an author now, soon to be published author. Paradox and power in caring leadership, and I've read the chapter that you've written with your wife.
Yes,
and this was fascinating to me. This idea that the caring leader, and for that to come from a military context.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that idea of the caring leader.
Well, I guess it's my wife. She's a classicist, especially in ancient Greek side of things, and we were approaching kind of what's the difference between military leadership now and then, and so she was looking at kind of Homeric writing, so the Odyssey and the Iliad. And how does a leader in those days express their care, and how did they care for their soldiers and their people? Whereas I was comparing it in the military, how do you care for your soldiers? And in the army, it's always that element of it, and through your year at Sandhurst, it's always drummed into the soldier. Your first job as an officer is look after your soldiers. So things like the motto at Sandhurst, and it has been since 1947, I think, is serve to lead. And even on the cap badge you wear on your beret.
Servant leadership before it was...
Absolutely, yeah. Exactly, yes. And it's that element of you put your soldiers first and everything else will follow. And it can show its way in various ways. So things like if you're off the regiment's out in the field on operations or training, if everyone's queuing to eat, then the soldiers eat first, and then the non-commissioned officers, then the officers. So the officers eat last, and it's pretty much you eat in kind of reverse rank order. And it's this idea that if you run out of food or run out of time to eat, then it's more important the soldiers get fed than the officers. And we also go on to talk about how in some ways it can be easier to care for your soldiers in the army than it may be for a leader in a civilian organisation to care for their workers, because of the nature of the relationship. And I think it's because the army is more of a way of life. So, for example, all your single soldiers, if you've got a platoon of soldiers, all the single soldiers will live in accommodation together, in flats together, or sometimes it used to be in shared rooms. The married soldiers all live off on an estate, all the soldiers together and all the officers together. When you have events, you have it's often with wives and kids there, and you have a vested interest in making sure what's kind of you'd have soldiers coming to you with problems about which school their kids got into, or housing problems, or financial problems. Whereas I think in most civilian organisations, someone wouldn't come to their manager with problems about which school their kid has got into, or whether they've got financial issues because they've got too many things on hire purchase or something like that. So I think the role of the leader in the army is much wider and spreads across much more of their soldier's life than it would be for a normal relationship between a manager and an employee in most civilian organisations.
Right.
So I see from many civilian organisations and experience now that people can work together for years before and never have actually met their colleagues' wives or kids, or husbands and kids, and they're basically their families. Whereas in the army, I'd be really surprised if you managed to get more than a few months without meeting kind of the soldier's family.
And it certainly isn't true that probably any manager in a corporation to have been through 11 months of training where the principal motto was about caring for your staff, and we see it in the rates of dissatisfaction in the workplace and how much it's correlated to the boss's behaviour.
And you still, don't get me wrong, you still get dissatisfaction, so that they have the army attitude surveys, I think they're called, every couple of years, and dissatisfaction is still there. However, it tends to be with, I mean, it's the same things you find in other places, kind of the pay, the stability of life. It's often to do with opportunities available, and a lot of it reflects on the senior leadership as opposed to, so people still find a lot of the senior leaders quite remote. But I think leadership at the more junior level, where it's more intimate, I think is very good.
Mm.
And don't get me wrong, you still get very good senior leaders, and I think it's often the perception of it. And you get senior leaders who are they're very aware that they need to be seen. So you'll often find someone who could be in charge of a division, so kind of tens of thousands of soldiers, and deployed across multiple countries. So it'd be very easy for them to be shut up in their office and ops room, kind of planning things and making decisions. But they'll still have time. They'll have kind of a couple of days a week when they're out on the road seeing people and being seen, because it's that kind of inspirational leadership thing. And right. you see. So when I was in Baghdad, Stanley McChrystal, General Stanley McChrystal, was my boss's boss, and so he was in charge of operations, sort of tens of thousands of soldiers across Iraq and Afghanistan. But he still made time when he visited our camp to come in for dinner and sit down at the table and chat to people. And I mean, the fact that I can still remember when he sat down at the table with me and a bunch of my friends for midnight dinner one night, and I can still remember kind of most of the conversation kind of 10 years later. And it's kind of, he was that kind of inspirational type of person.
Right.
And but also making time to actually get out there and be seen and lead.
Right. And spend time, really spend time with people
absolutely,
in a way that, I think it's certainly true. Most corporate CEOs, for example, wouldn't, in general, invest that much time in
But I think there's also
dining with their staff.
And the other thing I think in the military is that leadership is, you don't finish at Sandhurst and your training is done. Your leadership training, you finish your year of training there, and then you've got various other formal weeks that you need to go and do where it's more reflection and maybe going to leadership more depth. You have a mentor kind of coaching relationship, a mentoring coaching relationship with other leaders within your regiment. You then go back on formal courses as a captain, then as a major, and then as a colonel, and then even generals go back, and they will go back to the Army School of Leadership and have more time for reflection and coaching on their leadership. And these are people who are taking over kind of organisations of tens of thousands of people, and they're still going off for more leadership training.
Right. So that theme of making time for continuous improvement and training is
throughout, and it's seen as leadership is as an officer. Leadership is your trade. You're a leader first and foremost, and everything else second. Whereas how many times in a business organisation? So I was chatting to a guy who's he works for a Formula One company, and so most of the middle management there and senior management are engineers, and they've been promoted to be a middle manager because they're a great engineer. And then everyone's unhappy because they're a crap manager, and they're unhappy because they're not doing engineering anymore. So basically everyone's upset because they don't really see leadership as a trade in its own right. They haven't brought in a manager, they've kind of promoted this engineer. Yes. And I think that's quite common throughout the business world, where your people management and leadership, it's not seen as a trade, it's not seen as something your primary function. It's something that, great, you've been a great engineer, let's promote you to be a manager.
Yeah.
Rather than, you're a great engineer, let's make you a more senior engineer.
Yes,
and let's actually bring in professional managers they know a bit about engineering, but they've had a lot of training in management and
and crucially leadership. I mean,
yes.
And that ability to inspire and to look after and to serve in that way. I mean, those are really important ideas.
And obviously, as a leader, you do need to have an element of, you do need to know your business technically as well. But there was always the emphasis that your role first and foremost is leadership, and you've got to know enough technically to make decisions and to inform stuff. But you've got technical experts to help out as well.
Yeah. No, I think it's such an important point, and even in the way that we see now, sort of trust in corporations, and arguably, I think you can make the case that contributed to a wider breakdown and polarization in society is this lack of leadership within corporations and this lack of care for employees.
Yes,
as being something we've sort of lost somehow as an ethical imperative within the corporate world, and we're starting to see this shift with the Business Roundtable in the US and Jamie Dimon championing that idea that we need to start putting employees at the top of the stakeholder list rather than at the bottom. And so it is starting to shift, but it seems like the army's always had this, right? And it's something we can start to now draw on as
part of our article is talking about moral injury. And so moral injury was a concept, kind of really, the term was keyed by a guy called Jonathan Shea. So he was a psychologist working with Vietnam veterans, and he was treating PTSD, but he realised that PTSD is a post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's kind of a fear-driven reaction. So it's a mental reaction to a mental injury that's caused by a traumatic event, and largely fear-based. But he's realised that there was something that was missing there, because there were people who were coming back with PTSD type symptoms, but hadn't necessarily been exposed to that sort of traumatic event. So he coined this term moral injury, and it's basically this idea that it's a breach of what you hold to be fundamentally and morally correct, and often a breach of trust. And it's that how to put it? So it can lead to feelings of guilt or anger, and so it can lead to all sorts of other PTSD type symptoms. But it's not from the same thing as PTSD. It's not the same event that's caused it. But often they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So often he was finding that actually it's the people who were the hardest to treat were those who had PTSD, but with also some element of moral injury in there. And I think the moral injury has been more and more talked about within psychology, and looked at more across, because I think there's, especially within the recent wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, where you're fighting sometimes for morally ambiguous reasons, or sometimes the wrong reasons, or sometimes fighting for something where there's no real end in sight. There's nothing, you can't say, we've won, we can go home. It's not like kind of the Second War where you defeat Nazism and then it's great, everyone goes home. It's not like that. It's kind of we finished in Afghanistan and we're back, and suddenly, well, actually half the towns that we fought for and so many British soldiers and American soldiers died for, and they're back in the hands of the Taliban now. So kind of why were we there? What were we doing? Iraq, how many civilians and military died in Iraq? For how many weapons of mass destruction did we find? 0. And left a country now in turmoil and was bordering civil war in 2006 and 2007. So you're kind of fighting for these morally ambiguous things, and it's a lot easier to end up with some element of moral injury there, because it's calling into question, what do soldiers hold right and dear? But then we were looking at, well, and this, so Jonathan Shea, he wrote a very good book called Achilles in Vietnam, so he compares it to what Achilles was going through and the symptoms he displays. And he's kind of trying to say that, well, Achilles, he didn't have PTSD. He wasn't bothered by the trauma of hacking someone's leg off or something like that. But he did show the symptoms of PTSD, and it's more about that moral injury, because he's being kind of betrayed by Agamemnon in what he holds dear. But
this is going back to Greek legend.
Yes,
where Agamemnon takes his trophy
yes.
girl that he'd been
absolutely
given through
so
war.
And it's, I guess, the modern equivalent. So my wife was writing, so we'd written the article as kind of a conversation between myself and my wife, and so she's a doctor of classics, and she compares kind of Agamemnon's actions with, maybe in a civilian context, modern civilian context, a CEO earns a mega bonus, but then has to pay a lot of it back in tax. So to make up for the tax he's had to pay, he takes all the other people's bonuses to reimburse across the company to reimburse himself for the taxes he had to pay, which is kind of similar to what Agamemnon did by taking some of the basically a bonus away from Achilles because he'd lost his own bonus.
Right. Okay.
Or part of his own bonus.
Yeah. Well, and we do see that. I suppose we see that. I can see that in the corporate context all the time, where I can really see how people might experience moral injury based on actions of senior leaders in business. I mean,
Liz calls out another example that she read about within Nestle. So it was part of the controversy when they were promoting the use of baby formula. And this case study comes from Pakistan, where one of the Nestle employees ended up resigning because he could see how many babies were dying because they were promoting through doctors that people should use formula instead of breast milk. But the water wasn't purified, so babies then getting diarrhea because of impure water, and whereas breast milk is obviously clean, actually what's best for the child, but it wasn't best for corporations, and so obviously that led to a lot of the ways of restrictions on how they now sell formula. But in past cases, a lot of babies were killed because of the drive to actually use formula.
Yeah.
And so you could identify elements of moral injury in this man who had been selling this baby formula.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a very stark example, but we talk about it a lot about in transformation programs. I think there's a lot of this happens.
Yes.
Where people feel like maybe their job's gone, or parts of the company have been sacrificed, and yet the leaders at the top keep the bonuses. I mean,
yes,
it's almost every week you see another corporate example. I mean, I saw it in the Woodford, the hedge fund manager who took what was it, 13 million out in bonus, whilst all of his investors lose money as part of the fund. I mean, it's almost every week there's another example of a failure of leadership.
Senior
corporate
firms kind of collapsing and people making off with the money. And yes, absolutely.
Yeah. One could, I suppose, make the case that there is simply a lack of focus in developing leaders in the corporate realm.
Yes.
And giving people space to reflect on what does a moral leader look like? What do I look like as a moral leader? And
what are you there as a leader to do?
And what am I there as a leader to do?
I can't remember who writes is it Stephen Covey? Wrote the foreword for Turn the Ship Around, and his definition of leader was kind of a leader is someone who gets their followers to be the best they can, or kind of words to that effect. And while I don't necessarily agree with that in the whole, I think it is an element of leadership is to actually, it's how can you make the people that you serve be the best they can be.
Yeah.
So I think, that element of servant.
And having faith in them and being prepared. And the leader eats last, right? Being able to put my bonus at the back of the queue when it comes to saving the finances of the company.
So I read a case study. I don't know if it still happens, but certainly there's, because I think they've changed ownership, but was it Whole Foods, the American supermarket, kind of quite high-end, quite expensive supermarket, and
Whole Paycheck, as it gets called.
Yes, but they had I read a case study where they had a system where pay was worked out in multiples of kind of the basic pay packet. So someone with no management responsibilities or no leadership responsibilities working on the till, kind of they're on kind of that. That's the basic pay, and then a manager of the store can't earn more than however many multiples of that, and even the CEO couldn't earn more than, I can't remember how many multiples it was quite a few multiples, but couldn't earn more than a certain number of multiples of the lowest paid person in the organisation. So if the CEO wanted a whacking great pay rise, he had to give everyone a pay rise, and it worked in those multiples. So it actually did mean you didn't have these runaway situations where you've got CEOs who are earning hundreds and hundreds of what the lowest paid person earns, and kind of reaching earning in the first 3 or 4 days of the year what most people earn in a year, or what the average person earns in a year.
Yeah. Which I guess causes problems at all sorts of levels, but surely one of them is that it must be extremely difficult to empathise with,
absolutely,
with somebody
yes,
earning 1,000 times less than you, in terms of their experience of life and changes in the company. Let's say,
and it's. I mean, we to be honest, we hadn't really considered the idea of the difference in pay and the rise of inequality. But I think that absolutely could be where you'll see elements of moral injury.
And this is where I also think it does link to the broader societal problems that we're seeing in the polarisation and this increase of extreme political views at both ends of the spectrum. I do think business has a role in all of this. It's not just about the political realm.
Absolutely.
I think that the way that businesses can conduct themselves feeds into that. This is such an important question, I think, for us, is how do we bring leadership back in?
Yes.
Into the corporate world, right?
Yeah, and I don't think there's no right answer. There's probably going to be lots of answers, but some of it would have to be what do you reward a CEO for doing? Is it for raising the worth of the organisation? Is it for achieving a particular mission? Is it for increasing share price? And it's until you actually I think it's when you change what the CEO is there to do and what they're rewarded for doing. Because actually, if you compare share prices and CEO pay, even if I think it's meant to be that they're there to increase share price, or one of their prime reasons, but there's no match between what a CEO was paid in the 90s and the rise to what they're paid now compared to the rise in share prices since the 90s. There's no real correlation. And it just seems to be this runaway assumption that's what they're paid.
Yes, yes, I think that's a really useful place to start. Is how do we reward the CEO? Maybe the most important. But I also think this focus on leadership seems to me to be a very important one as well.
And it's that different emphasis on what leadership is. I think the idea of paying a CEO so much more, kind of hundreds of times more what someone else in the organisation is paid, it takes that view that this is a kind of a rock star, godlike figure who makes or breaks the organisation. Does it? Probably some of them do break the organisation, and no doubt some of them they do make the organisation. But there is so much more to the organisation than that, and it's if you take the idea that of kind of servant leadership, where actually it's about getting other people to do their best, where it then shifts the emphasis down of what's actually providing the profits in the organisation. Well, is it the CEO or is it the people further down who actually doing what the organisation does?
Yeah, I think these are really important questions, and I've just got in my ear now one of our previous guest, Tom van der Loob, who talks a lot about we shouldn't focus so much on leadership. Really, it's about the operating system of the organisation.
Yeah,
that we should really be focused on. It's these systems of how we manage that are most important, and that in itself guards against even the issue of having rogue leadership. But it takes leaders to create and maintain and nurture those systems.
And actually, one of the best books I've read in the past kind of few years, I think, one of my favourites is Reinventing Organizations. Frederick Laloux's work on this idea of tiered organisation. So you have self-managing teams. And that's absolutely brilliant. I think it's. I'd love to work kind of in that sort of manner. I think that.
Well, to some extent, you achieve that in your bubble of your
we try
highly self-managed. It sounds like
it was and it wasn't. So the times it was, and the times where that just wouldn't work. So kind of when you're in operation, you need to do things quickly. That model doesn't really work. But back in barracks, actually deciding what do we need to do training-wise or maintenance-wise? Absolutely, that does work. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not a model that would apply across the board, but I think it could successfully apply in a lot more places. And I think there are some quite big organisations that use it as well. I mean, I think, was it Patagonia, Gore-Tex and people like that?
Well, even Amazon, although in some ways they are very sort of centralised, it's certainly true from the people I've spoke to at Amazon that they do focus on these 2 pizza teams across large parts of Amazon, where they're highly autonomous, set their own mission.
Yes, I think different parts of Amazon. I think there are probably people maybe in the warehouse might disagree with that.
Well, exactly. Clearly, it changes. There's different subcultures in Amazon, but certainly
yes,
parts of it.
But any big organisation will have different subcultures here as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, massively so within the army. The army encourages it. I mean, that's why one of the reasons why they have the regimental system. The idea that the army is too big an organisation to self-identify with. So the regimental system, which has been around for hundreds of years, where you're in your regiment and that's who you identify with, and then you bring it down to kind of your company or your squadron, which is about 180 or so, and then your platoon about 30 or 40, and then your section, which is about 8 or 10. Again, it's those teams within teams, but it's, I guess, the largest bit you really identify with, where the badges you wear and stuff like that, and the regimental headdress you wear, and it's all about that regiment. And it's the regiment that has the history. It's the regiment that has the flag with the battle honours that, and the history that you study that goes back hundreds of years.
Yeah. But even interesting there to see that the pattern of the section you could almost say that's a two pizza team.
Yes.
Yeah. So, or the agile team, as you might say.
Yeah, in fact, I'm halfway through a book at the moment. So it's written by the commanding general at Sandhurst, and he's also in charge of army leadership and how the army teaches leadership at the moment. And he's written a book about lessons you can take from Sandhurst and about the training there. And he also writes up some personal examples of where things went right and wrong. And he gives an example where he was commanding a battle group, so probably about 600-700 soldiers on an exercise in Canada. And their first mission there had gone really, really badly wrong, and basically they'd failed. So obviously morale is massively down in the dumps, and they need to succeed on the next one they need to get declared, okay, your battle group is fit to fight and can go on operations. So it's quite high stakes. And he basically appealed to their identity. So it's giving that why are we going to work so hard on this next mission? Why are we going to pick ourselves up despite this failure and make the next one work? And he basically appealed to their sense that you're all Fusiliers, you're going to fight for each other, but also you don't want to let your teammate down, but also you don't want to let your predecessors down. I mean, the Fusiliers have got a proud history that goes back hundreds of years. You don't want to let them down. And also, I mean, a lot of families go family member in the same regiment. So chances are a lot of them would have had dads and uncles and granddads in the same regiment. So it's that appealing to that identity as a regiment.
Right. Yeah, that's very important. In fact, it reminds that's one of the. You talked about Jürgen Appelow at the start of this conversation, and his management 3.0, and he talks very, very much about identity. Invest in building an identity for your team. Give yourselves a name. Give yourselves an emblem.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think is a really important part of who we are as humans, and how we work together. We need these symbols
absolutely
to cohere, rather than the accounts payable department, right, which has been given to you as a badge by somebody.
So bomb disposal, we had Felix. So Felix the cat came around in Northern Ireland, and he was the mascot that went on badges and stuff, and then. So Felix was a real cat who came? No, it was. I think there are various stories about how it came about.
I'm just imagining a cat sort of.
No. So it's
creeping up to a bomb with a.
Felix the cat is kind of he's a cartoon character, so it's the cat with 9 lives.
Oh, okay.
And it's so the Northern Ireland picture of Felix is a picture of this cartoon cat with kind of a green helmet on, and then they adapted him for Iraq. And it was kind of, again, Felix the cat with Arab headdress on. And then they've got the Felix for Afghanistan, or Afghan Pashtun hat.
Okay.
In fact, the identity, the mug I'm drinking from here, it's still and that's the Iraq Felix on there.
Okay.
And again, it's still that identity of.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the extent where there's a bomb disposal charity that looks after kind of the families and the people who worked in bomb disposal. It's not just the operators; it's everyone involved in bomb disposal, and that's called the Felix Fund.
Okay.
And again, so that's raised a lot of money for the people there. But again, it's Felix the cat popping up around the place, and
yeah, important.
Yeah, and it's that identity, as you said, that it's that. It's having that identity and that linkage with it.
Mm. And one thing that just came up when you were describing the author of this book and his reflecting on his failures, what was your biggest mistake you made in the army, and what did you learn from it?
Probably, so again, I was back in Basra. I was commanding a weapons intelligence team, and the team was made up of people from lots of different units. I had military police, army intelligence, RAF intelligence, bomb disposal operators, all together in this team. And some of the team would go out on the ground to visit events, and often quite gory sites, and going out and sometimes being shot at. I always kept a careful eye on those who go on the ground for stress levels and how they're handling it, especially if they've seen something particularly gruesome. So you look at, well, what's the traumatic damage that could be happening mentally, and looking after their mental state. I also had team members who never went out on the ground, and they just worked in the office day to day. And we were based at the contingency operating base of the Cobb, in Basra Airport. So people who never left camp were known as Cobbits. And so I never really, and the Cobb would often get rocketed. It would get rocketed most days, sometimes up to 17 times a day, and getting hit by rockets of various size. So the siren would go when this basically it's radar detecting, and when it detects rockets coming in, the siren would sound. Everyone hit the floor, pull your body armor and helmet on, and then start waiting for the bangs. And then when you then have to basically lie on the floor till the all clear goes. Now, I mean, for most of us going on the ground, it's just another rocket attack, lie on the ground. When it finishes, get up, carry on business. It just wasn't something we considered as an issue. It's just something. It's just a matter of. It's just how you worked. It's just a fact of daily life. I mean, it's sometimes annoying if you were kind of just walking back from the shower or something like that, and you get a siren go, and then you're lying in a ditch getting all muddy and dusty, having just had a shower, and then especially if there are water restrictions on, because then it's like, well, now I'm going to try and wipe all this mud off with a towel. But it was mainly as an inconvenience or as anything else. And I didn't really consider that actually some people might find being rocketed several times a day is traumatic, because I guess it wasn't in comparison to what we were doing out on the ground. So I didn't really pay much attention to some of my analysts who weren't going out.
The Cobbits.
The Cobbits who weren't leaving the wire. And one of them did develop problems. He went home and on R&R, then didn't come back because of stress and kind of a traumatic reaction to the rocket attacks. I think that's probably my biggest failure. Is I think I regard it as a complete failure of leadership. As I should have been paying attention to him. I should have been paying attention to. I shouldn't have been focusing my attention on the people going on the ground, and I should have spotted this before it was a problem. Mm. So I think I at the time I took it pretty hard, because it was a pretty bloody big failure of leadership. I shouldn't have made those assumptions that I did.
Yeah. And how's it changed your outlook now?
I think one of the biggest things was that different people have different levels of what they're comfortable with stress-wise. And you can't assume that just because you're completely happy with a level of stress, it's not going to affect other people. And I think that applies not just to traumatic levels, but it also can be to work stress. In fact, I think I came along to something that you ran in London, and I can't remember, it was one of the it was about well-being, and one of the speakers was talking about stress curves, how that if you've basically got a bell-shaped curve, and if you've got someone with no stress, then they're probably not working particularly efficiently. Whereas they've got too much stress, again, they're not working efficiently. It's finding that correct level of stress to actually where people are their most effective. And everyone's curve is different. And I don't think, I didn't know that, and I didn't take that into account. So it wasn't that realization that if it's a level of stress that I was comfortable with and other people were comfortable with, which I didn't really account for it, that other people might not be comfortable with it.
Right.
And it actually, less than comfortable with it, actually it had taken them to breaking point. Yeah, so at the session, we, I can't remember who it was, it showed us a stress curve where you got stress along the x-axis, then y-axis was how well you performing at your job. And obviously right at the bottom left corner, where you've got no stress, people don't perform particularly well because there's no real driver for it. Whereas if you go all the way over to the right-hand side, then again, performance drops right the way off because there's too much stress. And there's that peak of performance where there's just the right amount of stress, kind of Goldilocks style. And I think the mistake I made was that I assumed that I didn't know about this curve then, and I didn't really consider it. And I made the assumption that because I was, and most of my team were operating fine at a certain level of stress, that actually that level of stress maybe already have dropped off and become traumatic for another person. So it's not having that realization that different people have different tolerances for stress, for how efficiently they work, and also for what they would find as traumatic, and that they can't carry on working at that level.
Yeah.
And I think so that was quite an extreme example, because it was the stress that tipped him over was the stress from basically being attacked with rockets multiple times a day, every day. Obviously the carryover I see is coming over into the civilian world is the stress that you put on someone for, be it deadlines or the amount of work someone has to do, or the urgency of a work, whatever it takes to put stress on someone. Different people have different levels of stress they're comfortable with. And some people will react well to, we've got to get this done kind of tonight, and it's kind of really manic, and some people rise to it and they love it, and that's when they really excel at running around, their hair on fire, and absolutely love it, and that's when they're happiest. Probably can't do it for too long, but it's kind of when the adrenaline is really pumping, that's a great place to be. Whereas other people, if you put them under that sort of pressure, would kind of clam up, but it's not to say they're not a great worker, because it's often that person who could clam up under that kind of pressure, they will do great work if it's more gradual, or it could be at the same pace, but without that pressure being piled on about the imminent deadline, or someone really jumping up and down and saying, we need this now. They could be doing it at the same pace, but it's without that pressure being applied, and without the stress levels coming up.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important point. How do we somehow get clear on what our biases are, and find ways to not have the way we enjoy the world or see the world be the model or the template we use for assessing somebody else's well-being. It's a tough one, isn't it? And I'm just reminded of me with my partner. I have, or at least my story is that I have a much higher tolerance for ambiguity than she does. And so I'll be in a situation where there's not a lot of plan and there's not a lot of details and we're not quite sure what's going to happen, and I'll be completely comfortable. She'll be tearing her hair out, right? And it's me, and it's very easy to, what's there to worry about? We'll be fine. We're not going to die. So given that, why should we be worried? Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's that I think you're right. That's evolution of a leader, isn't it? Is a big part of that, is being able to empathise and to sort of be vigilant for other people's well-being.
So I think it's James Salter, I think, puts it quite nicely. He's got a 3 Ps model where he sees leadership in concentric rings. So you've got kind of personal, private, and public. So public is obviously when you're leading teams of however many people, it's your kind of public, how you lead a team. Then you've got your private leadership, which is you kind of one-on-one interactions. So your one-on-one interactions with members of those team, or how do you lead as individuals. Then you've got your personal, that's the core, which is just yourself. And that's elements of kind of your presence as a leader, your expertise. So it's your professional knowledge of what your job is, but also your professional knowledge of leadership. It's your leadership toolbox. But it's also yourself, and what's critical there is your self-awareness. So it's being aware of where do you sit on, and it's where do you sit kind of your comfort with ambiguity, your comfort with stress.
It's rocket attacks.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and it's being self-aware to actually, and also knowing what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. What styles of leadership work for you, what don't, what do you need to improve, where are you uncomfortable, where are you comfortable. I think I quite like that model, is kind of having. You've got to, for any form of leadership, you've got to have that core of yourself, you've got to get yourself right before you can actually start expanding and actually leading others.
Yeah. If there was a point to end on it, that feels like it's the one to end it on. Absolutely. So brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Stories and being so willing to answer that last question about failure. That's it's great that you were prepared to go there. So. Thank you, Ben. It's been an education. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting
me.
Thank you. Yes.
Cheers.